Jeremiah lived during a time when the power of Assyria was beginning to diminish, and ultimately Babylon takes over, and the Babylonians become the world empire of the day. In fact, in Jeremiah chapter 1, verse 2, it talks about the word of the Lord coming to Jeremiah in the days of Josiah, verse number 2. In the days of Jehoiakim, the son of Josiah, king of Judah, verse 3. Until the end of the 11th year of Zedekiah, until the carrying away of Jerusalem captive. Jeremiah is given the task of telling this nation that you are going to be led away into captivity because of the way that you have lived, the way that you have forsaken the law of God. So on this occasion and the next, I want to talk about items that you find in the beginning of that message of Jeremiah to the nation of Judah. Verses 1 through verse 16 of chapter 2 deals with going from following God to forsaking God. And then in verse 17 down through the end of the chapter, when responsibility, something is totally abandoned. To begin with, what happens with this change from following God to forsaking God? To begin with, in verse number 2 and verse number 3 of the second chapter, he talks about what Israel used to be before he starts talking about what they had become. So beginning in verse number 1, moreover, the word of the Lord came to me, Jeremiah says, saying, go and cry in the hearing of Jerusalem, saying, thus says the Lord, I remember you, the kindness of your youth. And then in verse 3, Israel was holiness to the Lord, the first fruits of his increase. That's what they used to be. The kindness that existed within the attitude and heart of that nation, even though they murmured and complained all the way through that trek across the Sinai Peninsula after God freed them from Egyptian bondage and slavery. Murmuring and complaining seemed to be a characteristic of that nation. But God classifies them as being kind in their youth, being the first fruits of God's increase. Beginning in verse 4, there's a change. Verse 4, hear the word of the Lord, O house of Jacob, and all the families of the house of Israel. Thus says the Lord. Verse 5. First problem on the list. What injustice have your fathers found in me, God says, that they have gone far from me, have followed idols, have become idolaters. There's a change. We're not concerned about the law of Moses anymore. We want to actually be like everybody else. We see these other individuals that kind of chart their own course. They create their own gods. They don't follow any kind of statutes other than what their heart desires. We kind of like that. So what happens with that kind of change? Well, with that kind of change, verse number 5 and verse number 6, there is an absence of concern. Neither did they say, where's the Lord who brought us out of the land of Egypt, who led us through the wilderness, through a land of deserts and pits, through a land of drought and shadow of death, through a land where no one crossed and no one dwelt. God got us through that land, but nobody remembers that. There's an absence of concern, really an absence of reflection. We're not going to remember anything that goes back to that, because if we do, we may find ourselves feeling responsible, and we don't want that to happen. So in verse number 7, the graciousness that should have existed was something that was totally absent. I brought you into a bountiful country to eat its fruit and its goodness. But when you entered, you defiled my land and made my heritage an abomination. These individuals, rather than being thankful, viewed themselves as being entitled to a land that had been promised to their forefathers. But with that entitlement came this idea that we'll just disregard God. This is something that we are entitled to, and we will treat it however we wish. Well, what about the leadership? What about those that were in positions of responsibility? Did they pull the people back? And the answer is no. Instead, you found leaders that had no direction whatsoever. Verse number 8. The priest did not say, where's the Lord? Those who handle the law did not know me. The rulers also transgressed against me. The prophets prophesied to Baal and walked after things that do not profit. No matter where you turn, looking for individuals in positions of authority, they had disregarded God as well. Leadership had no direction. Verses 9 and 10, the coming judgment. that actually is going to take place. Therefore, God says, I will yet bring charges against you, says the Lord, and against your children. Against your children's children I will bring charges. For pass beyond the coast of Cyprus and see, send it to Kedar, and consider diligently, and see if there has been such a thing as this. Verse 11 and verse 12, number 6 on the list. The exchange of God for things that are false, the replacement of things that are good for things that are evil. Has the nation changed its gods, which are not gods? But my people have changed their glory for what does not profit. Be astonished, O heavens, at this. Be horribly afraid. Be very desolate, says the Lord. Replacing things that are good for things that are evil. Statutes that used to be seen as eternal statutes in nature, absolute right, absolute wrong, have been abdicated for something far less costly in the eyes of the population. And they follow their heart's desire, as wrong as that heart's desire may be. Point number 7, verse 13. My people have committed 2 evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn themselves cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water. We don't talk about cisterns very often in our culture. It's not something that is very commonplace. It's not really a well where you have spring water actually coming into the bottom of the well, but it's a holding tank for water. And the picture that God paints in this verse is you had waters that would continue to flow into the well that I provided, but you didn't want that. So you dug storage tanks that actually were broken to begin with, cracks in the bottom. They're not even going to hold water in the first place. You're going to die of spiritual thirst when an abundance of spiritual truth was at your fingertips. What happens when following turns into forsaking? Exactly what happened to the children of Israel in the southern kingdom of Judah. And again, it sounds exactly like, looks exactly like what you hear and what you see on the evening news. History, tragedies of history, repeating themselves in this 21st century. I really hope people start waking up. I hope that's your prayer as well. Please stay safe. We'll talk again soon.